Welcome to CannaBiz with Canna-Chris. I'm Chris Nanny, also known as Canna-Chris, and I'm with my co-host, Austin Slutsky.
Love being here, Chris.
Thanks for being on the show, Austin. Today we're going to be talking about what to do once a license has been granted and how to maximize workforce productivity. Let's get started. Austin, what's new in cannabis?
So we have a brand new proposal that was just announced that would finally allow VA doctors to recommend medical marijuana to all their veteran patients.
I'm guessing they weren't allowed to do it before. Why not?
So the VA is a federal institution program.
Okay.
So because marijuana is federally legal, the VA never had the ability to offer these recommendations to their patients. But with a bill like this, it would finally allow some of these veterans who've had conditions like chronic pain and PTSD to finally get access to medical marijuana that has been shown to be pretty effective in treating these kind of conditions.
And are there any roadblocks in the way as far as the legislation goes within Congress?
Well, recently, Pete Sessions was the anti-cannabis chair of the House Rules Committee. I mean, he's been the one that's kind of been blocking these amendments in the past, but he's not at the head of the chair anymore. So Earl Blumenauer, he's been the one that's been putting forward these bills. It looks like he has a much better chance of finally getting this through and put into law.
Okay, that's exactly what I was going to ask next, kind of the prognosis. So it looks like positive signs so far with a good potential of it passing.
You know, I like to think that there's a pretty good chance. With a government agency like the VA, you never can know for sure. But I mean, with public support growing, with a lot of people, vets who could probably use this or have the option to use this, I see a lot of benefit in heading this direction. And I think that we'll probably see it in the near future.
Going off that, I also have personally a lot of friends who are veterans who have spoken of the benefits of using it. And one of them in particular I'm thinking of does have PTSD. And he says, he medicates when he needs to and he feels a lot better. He can control himself. And it's just a great thing. So I'm very much in favor of this. Speaking of more good news, the Minority Cannabis Business Association just released a model social equity ordinance. And it's designed to help individuals and communities harmed from the war on drugs re-enter the cannabis industry.
Well, that sounds like it's really good. How important is this?
So it's very important to the community as a whole. And historically, the United States in the past has had some very strict drug laws, and even more importantly, they've been disparately impacting communities of color. So for example, African Americans are more than 4 times likely to be arrested on marijuana charges compared to their white counterparts, even though both groups have almost identical usage rates. Yeah, and so some of the highlights of this bill would include giving technical assistance to those applicants, helping them through the application process, providing educational services so they know how to run a business afterwards, and even a community reinvestment fund just to kind of educate the community on what's going on in cannabis, why it's important, and how you can get involved. So the NCB, it's looking like their next step is to get localities to start adopting this ordinance, and it's looking like they're going to provide a case study in the soon future to kind of support these findings and help validate what they see as a very big problem in the community.
Well, that's awesome. Seems like a great way to get those who have been disadvantaged in the past, back into the community, offer some jobs, opportunities that probably wouldn't have been available otherwise, and should be doing a whole lot of good.
Absolutely, and these are people that they were in the industry before it was legalized, and now since it is legalized, we're seeing people profit off it. It's only right that they get a seat at the table as well.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So I got some big news. The largest acquisition in cannabis history just went down recently. So an Arizona-based Harvest Health and Recreation just reached an agreement to acquire Verano Holdings for $850 million. Yeah, so it's the largest acquisition in cannabis, and once this deal finally closes, Harvest will be one of the largest U.S. cannabis chains. So the merger will allow them to have over 200 marijuana cultivation facilities, 123 retail stores in 16 different states.
So it's looking like Harvest is really making some moves to be one of the bigger players in the U.S.
Yeah, like a lot of U.S. cannabis companies, they did something similar to what Harvest did, where they did a reverse merger to get on the Canadian Securities Exchange and become a public company. And it basically, mergers like this, these acquisitions, really allow them to scale up and compete with these larger Canadian companies like your Kronos Group and Canopy Growth once they start looking to their neighbors down below in the U.S. market once we start getting some more efforts into legalization.
That's great. Well, I will say good luck to Harvest. Competition within the community is always good. Development, innovation, so I think it's a great idea. Thanks for updating us on what's happening in cannabis, Austin. For all of our listeners, make sure to like and subscribe to our podcast. Up next, we're bringing on JP Passion, a lab director from MedMen, to explain what happens in post-licensing. on to our show today from the West Coast, we have the Director of Laboratory Compliance from MedMen, JP Passion. Welcome to the show, JP.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me, Chris.
Pleasure to have you. So we're all excited to have you here. But first, let's get some background information on you. What kind of led you to starting a career in cannabis?
My technical background is in biochemistry and pharmacology. I started in the industry of the pharma and the biotech industry as a assay developer. I developed assays that can predict whether you are injured from blunt head trauma all the way to cardiovascular disease that predicts the risk of a cardiovascular event within 5 years. Targeting small biotechs like I did gave me the ability to have a work culture, a work environment that very much cultivates collaboration. And so how I decided to target the small volatile biotech industry was to actually gain the technique and the experience in assay development that is needed for research and also upscale out to market. One of the most recent assays that I was involved in developing, which brought me to the cannabis industry, was a point of care device for law enforcement to measure the amount of drugs on the panel for drivers that are suspected to be under the influence of drugs. One of the drugs on that panel that I had to develop was THC. And it basically, that experience developing an assay for THC that opened the door into the cannabis industry. And by open the door, I meant lighting a fire in my curiosity as to why there aren't resources to help develop this industry when clearly there was a need for it. That took me to the company MedMen, and MedMen was at its very infancy. Before MedMen Enterprises, it was a bunch of subsidiaries. And so at the very infancy of MedMen, I started as a lab director when they first acquired a license in New York. And it's with my experience as their lab director that I was able to transfer my knowledge from technology transfer on the assay development side, so the life sciences side, to the analytical chemistry side. I developed the initial methods to support cultivation and to support production and manufacturing of products in the state of New York. And from those methods that I developed there, I was able to work up the chain in MedMen to become the 16th employee of MedMen Enterprises and to expand the proprietary methods, analytical methods across the nation to other states that they've decided to work in. So they manage and operate licenses in the cannabis industry, and most predominantly they're in the micro business industry of cannabis, which is, for example, in California, a micro business license, 3 types of licenses, and that's usually cultivation, manufacturing, and distribution. And so within these vertically integrated facilities, there needs to be an analytical lab for not only quality control purposes, but also for optimization and risk management. And so I developed into a role of laboratory compliance because in a lot of states across the nation, compliance and regulatory standards are different. And so I was tasked with making sure that the labs also follow the same regulatory and compliance standards as third-party testing facilities. So if our viewers don't understand, a owner of a license or cannabis license cannot also hold a license for cannabis laboratory testing for impartiality's sake and conflict of interest. In order to validate and verify methods in the cannabis industry, you would need to perform what a quality industry calls a proficiency test.
Okay, that seems pretty standard. You can't test their own product and tell me it's safe. I'd much prefer a third party do that just so I can have, like you were saying, impartiality to it.
Correct. And to further prove impartiality, it was my duty to do due diligence on these third-party labs that we would collaborate with, because simply there is no point collaborating with a lab that doesn't have integrity or doesn't have an accreditation or credibility to their work. When we're, at the time, MedMen, when we're trying to break that stereotype and bring credibility to the cannabis industry. So in that sense, I became qualified as an ISO 17025 certified accredited auditor, and ISO is an international standard that is recognized around the world and used to accredit laboratory testing facilities and proves their competency essentially for testing or calibrating products. And this is an approach that I'm very familiar with in previous industries, in the pharma industry, in the drug industry, in the biotech industry. We are all held to a federal standard that we have to comply by in order to prove efficiency, in order to prove competency, and in order to give credibility to the output of testing facilities. Albeit the marijuana industry, or at least marijuana, isn't federally legal, it's still important to at least hold yourself, especially the laboratories or quality laboratories inside vertically integrated facilities, to hold themselves to the same standards as those of the testing laboratories, so that there's a harmonization in terms of methods and analytical data that is output.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense, that you would want to make sure you get, the highest quality facilities to kind of push the best product out. So can you go a little more in depth in how you get these facilities accredited and what you're really looking for when you're narrowing it down and picking the best route?
So when it comes to accrediting facilities, the facility in itself has to hold a laboratory license. And if the facility itself has a laboratory license, it cannot hold any other cannabis license that's distribution, cultivation, or manufacturing. And so I really catered my career to the micro business licensing, and that is manufacturing, the cultivation, and distribution. And so there's no need for an analytical laboratory within this micro business or vertically integrated system to be accredited, because they're not being held accountable on a federal level or even a statutory or local jurisdictional level for an accreditation. However, an accreditation requires the same structure as Better Business Bureau system. So it basically integrates quality manual systems that give credibility to laboratory testing facilities. So like you mentioned before, it's within a brand conglomerate like MedMen to go and strive for a higher standard, even though they're not being held accountable to it. And so what I did was take into account the collaborating departments like cultivation, manufacturing, and sometimes even production, and bring that into a quality manual system that complies to standards from ISO. And then from those quality manual standards, that can be transferred onto other facilities that they may have that are satellite facilities. But at the same time, I could use that structure of a quality manual system to compare against those that have licenses in laboratories like third-party testing laboratories.
And just to go off that real quick, the quality manual systems, have you noticed that once you've started to create these and use them, has it helped MedMen internally kind of streamline the process, make things more efficient inside?
Absolutely, especially when you're being audited by state regulators or local jurisdictions that come from parallel industries like the pharma and the biotech. The cannabis industry hasn't really been touched by regulation when it comes to a federal standard, but the only people qualified to actually audit these departments, to audit the industry, are those that come from federally regulated industries. So the foundation of auditing somebody comes from accredited programs like ISO or nationally renowned programs that are vetted FDA and EPA, like HACCP programs or CAPA responses. And putting these programs together, which include things like training programs, onboarding programs, waste management, and even down to OSHA requirements, the safety and environmental health of facilities. These are programs that need to be put into place not only to protect the liability of the company in itself, but to also protect the people who work in there and also protect the outcome of the manufacturing and cultivation and products. If there were to be a problem on the back end or on a receiving end of a cultivation facility, if they had programs that are compliant with federally mandated programs, then it would be easy to troubleshoot and find the root cause. And at the same time, it would be easy to pass regulators, auditors, and other scrutinizing organizations that the cannabis industry will be held against to.
So a quick question on that. When these regulators come in, be it state or local, what are some of the things they're looking for, and how have you kind of helped make it easier, I guess, for them to see that you're compliant, and as a whole make MedMen just a little easier to work around?
It's simply showing the accreditation certificate and also other certificates of compliance to internationally recognized programs like good manufacturing practices or good laboratory practices. There are other third-party certifiers and auditors that give out their specific certificates for specific things, like, say, for example, safety or good labeling practices. Now, it's basically proof that you're following a federally mandated program or standard that would help auditors and regulators come in and recognize a facility as legitimate and credible.
Wonderful insight right there. We have a quick break. We're just going to remind all of our listeners to like, subscribe, and share this episode. And we'll be back shortly with even more of JP's experience. So we are back with JP Passion, Lab Director from MedMen. And if you could talk a little bit more about some easy ways that you can increase productivity in labs or just in general.
Depending upon the license that they have to consider how they're going to comply by local jurisdiction. And if they do have a license for a testing laboratory, they have to also understand how to comply with local jurisdiction. So there is a marriage between third-party laboratories and vertically integrated facilities. So one thing to consider when you just get a license for a laboratory is to consider location. You have to consider city ordinance. You also have to consider local ordinance down to either the county or up to the state. You also have to consider sampling processes depending upon what state you got your license in. And then you also have to consider a laboratory information management system for all of the data that you'll be accumulating. And so these are the bigger business aspects to think about when you get a laboratory license, a testing facility license. On the other hand, if you get a vertically integrated license, this would also include a quality control laboratory in there to monitor all metrics of quality, say, for example, suppliers and vendors, where you get packages, where you get material for cultivation, and where you might get material for manufacturing when you put together, say, for example, tinctures. You would need to have a quality control department, which is usually a laboratory in a vertically integrated facility, to be able to maintain and optimize your metrics so that you don't have any drawbacks in the production of products.
And JP, on that note, we have talked a little bit in the earlier segment about having an independent testing facility. With vertically integrated ones, we have an internal one, but there's also an external third-party testing facility as well, correct?
Correct.
And so what are some of the benefits of having the internal lab facility instead of going straight to the third party right away?
It's very costly to send samples at every step of manufacturing, cultivation, or production to third-party testing laboratories. And that cost can skyrocket very much, especially when you're troubleshooting or optimizing processes within your vertically integrated system. And at the same time, there are some states that require these third-party laboratory testing facilities to report the results of any samples from manufacturers, and that in itself might open a Pandora's box for the vertically integrated facilities. They don't like to share information on things they might be doing wrong or things that they might be doing badly at. And so on that note, there's a cost, but then there's also a quality measure to go with it. You want to mitigate risk, and you want to be able to assess that constantly or on a defined period when it comes to vertically integrated facilities. And to mitigate that risk, you put in critical, what we call HACCP plans. There are points of possible contamination or points where you can get a product from a supplier or vendor that doesn't meet your specified requirements. And so you would actually need to have a lab inside to judge that and to essentially be your first step of risk mitigation.
So let's say you've made a decision to get with this internal lab, work with an internal lab. What are some of the easier ways that you can help optimize the product and really start to increase productivity like throughout your lab?
If you do collaborate with a third-party lab that is accredited, then you can definitely benefit from this third-party lab because they have a systematic approach to how to analyze data and to actually use objective evidence to your benefit. So, for example, in vertically integrated facilities, we get a lot of competent and qualified people, but they're qualified on subjective matters. So, for example, the judgment on how good bud looks is definitely based on something subjective, from looks to smell, essentially. The only objective thing is by weight. But to actually define whether for example, your lights, are your lights high enough? Are your lights the right UV? Do they have the right wavelength? All of these questions should be answered with objective evidence. And the only way to do that is with analytical data or from an analytical testing lab. And so with objective evidence, with supportive data, you can actually make judgment calls through your whole processes in each department that are optimized.
But how do you identify what really needs to be improved? And do you have any examples of, an area that you saw where there was just a massive deficiency, that there was a big opportunity, a chance to really increase what you saw as just a negative at one point?
So in an example that I have, working with MedMen, we manage vertically integrated facilities in different states. Now, we have to comply by individual state regulations, but the state regulators don't direct us how to run the business. So an example where you can use standardization to help optimize something is, I remember one time in one of the facilities that was creating product materials for production. A lot of the issue in the cannabis industry is collaborating with other reputable companies or providers and vendors. Not a lot of vendors, for example, in the science industry, there are reputable brands like Agilent, like Thermo Fisher. I remember they wouldn't work with us because we are affiliated with the cannabis industry, which is federally illegal, and they don't have a policy for that. So I couldn't buy a quality component because nobody would want to sell to us. So then you would have to resort to other resources. So I remember one time we were getting a huge shipment from China, and this vendor wasn't vetted or hasn't gone through any due diligence, and we got the bottles or the components contaminated, clearly contaminated just visually at that. And so we're not going to put our products in that and then also sell it to the consumer. One way to mitigate this is to implement a supplier vendor program. And these are programs that are required for ISO accreditation or some standardization out there. And so having a supplier and vendor program will mitigate that risk, therefore clearing you from any non-foreseen issues that may push out due dates that may be hard to find the root cause of if you don't have systematic approaches that are similar to those that are already well recognized and federally vetted. Then you're going to spend a lot of time having to do a root cause analysis to find what is causing all of your products to fail or what is causing contamination. You also lose faith in regulatory bodies, statutory levels, or even local jurisdiction levels. So it puts the licensee holder of vertically integrated facilities in a very unfortunate position.
And JP, I kind of want to switch gears a little bit and get your personal opinion on this. So recently, there's been a lot of allegations in the media, I'm sure you've seen, about cannabis companies in general, either not being diverse enough or making some racial comment or something along those lines. How do you think these companies should respond to these kind of allegations?
Well, from my personal experience, I see that in a lot of industries. I see this in the industry I came from, in the pharmaceutical industry and the biotech industry, and I'm also seeing it in parallel industries when it comes to what I see on the media. So what I do, at least for the companies that I work with, is to be a proponent of transparency and to be a proponent of objective evidence. When it comes to roles and responsibilities, or even salary at that, of course, there is going to be a level of discretion, but there needs to be an understanding that these are the limits, that this is your standard of acceptance. You have to be completely open and almost lean into vulnerability. Have those talks with your manager. It's almost like changing this perspective of a generation here. here. To defeat a lot of the negativity is to actually approach this on a very humanistic level, so that it is approaching it with transparency, truth, and integrity. For example, if somebody blurts out something that you don't agree with, then you actually do have to take that initiative and let them know that you are not comfortable with that. You actually do have to break that. Sometimes it's a cultural issue. Me being an immigrant, I was raised to hold all of those emotions in, or to at least play the nice guy. But sometimes it's just not very healthy to hold in a lot of emotions, I guess, if you will. And so to mitigate that, it's to just be truthful with yourself. Is this something that you as a person agree upon in a work environment? Is this where you want to be? Is this something you want to be a part of? These are questions you really had to ask yourself, at least from my perspective, to mitigate negativity in workplace environments. First of all, respect myself and be truthful to myself, but then B, hold the people accountable as well, and then use objective evidence.
Yeah, it's great hearing from you, your personal view on what tends to be a real tough issue for a lot of people out there. But this community as a whole is really inclusive. We really want, the cannabis industry to be as collaborative as possible. So where can our viewers connect with you, hear more about the work you do?
LinkedIn. All I have is my LinkedIn profile. You could search my name, JP Passion. In the sciences, I'm a part of cannabis working groups, a part of ACIL, accredited bodies like A2LA, AOAC, which is an international organization for analytical chemists, ASTM, which is an association of standard technical methods. I'm a huge proponent of that.
I really like the passion you have when you bring to this, and it's been great having you on the show. So I'll also tag you on the post that we're going to make so everyone can find you a little bit easier. And I just want to say we really appreciate you kind of educating us, walking us through the post-licensing process, how to optimize a business. And for all of our listeners out there, we'd like to remind you one more time, subscribe and share this podcast if you enjoy our content. I'm Canna-Chris, also known as Chris Nanny.
And I'm Austin Slutsky.
And we'll see you next week.